pull it together a little bit more. Meg gave me a particular charge, so to some extent, and I follow orders. The charge that she gave me was to look at what systemic functional linguistics might have to say, or did say for me as I started looking at it, for higher education contexts, learning development, obviously they're different, but in the case of language acquisition, you can put the two of them pretty closely together in an educational environment in higher education. So as I was thinking of this session this evening, I thought, okay, the supposition is that the theory has something to say, and which of its major approaches, whether underlying assumptions or actually major constructs, have I found particularly intriguing and have in fact then worked with. Tying together what I hear across our panel here, critique and emendations, expansions, I think it is important to say right up front that there is a difference in the position that both of them came from if we're looking at Vygotsky and Halliday. As was said, Vygotsky is a psychologist who is looking at the concerns that he sees at his time about how psychology addressed these issues. You can make a similar argument for Halliday. And so he, however, comes as a linguist and says, what do I see in linguistics that concerns me, that doesn't address what I think needs to be addressed? And I think number one is the whole notion of what does it mean to claim, as he will ultimately, of course, claim very decidedly, to claim for a natural functional theory of language. That language in and of itself is meaning-oriented. If that is the case, then the entire analysis of language has to be set up differently than it has been set up before. So, like all people that develop such things, they develop their things in context of what am I speaking for, what am I speaking against, and what do I therefore want to put out very strongly. And residing as a linguist in England, obviously you look at major people like Saussure, you look at Jenslev, you look at Firth, you look at Malinowski, you look at the European context of the things that have been said by Prague School linguistics, and you say, what's going on here that would allow me to pull out major issues that a theory of language, and therein lies a difference. This is a claim for a theory of language and the constructs and processes it needs to have in order to be a naturally functional theory of language. Now, I'm going to go into this somewhat extensively on Monday. I don't want to bore you with you now, but it is the only functional theory of language that makes that strong claim. And it makes that strong claim by saying that it is the grammatical system itself that is functional, that distinguishes massively from other functional theories of language, which really are not as comprehensive as that. So you have a complete rethinking of grammar in that regard, because, and I'll go into that on Monday also, the major trope up until then, misunderstanding to some extent what Saussure had said, namely, was the arbitrariness of language. Now, if you're going to say that language in and of itself as a semiotic system is functional, you cannot have at the same time a statement of the arbitrariness of the whole thing is just completely contradictory. So then you have to find a way. In what way is language naturally functional system. And what aspects make it so? And what does it mean for the analysis of language? And what does it mean for grammar? And as all of you who have done any looking at that, is it a complete reconceptualization of the notion of grammar? Where grammar was seen only as structural and formal, at best in a syntagmatic relationship, and of course had the burdens of Saussure underneath it. Halliday's choice is to say, I am looking at choices of meaning making. So I'm looking at meaning making networks. So the deliberate choice is to look at paradigmatic relationships. If you're going to look at meaning making, obviously the two axes relate to each other, but the primary axis is the one of meaning making, and if that is so, then it is an issue of choices that are being made. And so you need to set up a theory of language, and this is, of course, a very different approach, a theory of language that then has as its meta-functional aspects things that are central to human meaning making. And the two that were identified, of course, as being central to meaning making is language construes experience. In other words, so you immediately have an interpretive and creative and agentive notion of what language is. And at the same time, it enacts interpersonal relationships. It construes experience, and simultaneously, there is no other way, there is no separate pragmatics, because those things happen inherently together. And of course, the way they can be realized only, because we can't talk on top of each other, is in a textual environment. So you have construing experience, enacting interpersonal relationships, and constructing the discourse itself in oral and written texts. So it is these three meta-functional environments that he takes as central, and then builds an entire theory of language on this and says, if that is so, let us go look whether we can analyze language and how its lexicogrammatical features in fact make that possible. And those would be the interesting things to look at in order to construct a theory of language that is in fact meaning-oriented. So we have to start from there. And then there are any number of things that will be central. You will have, if I wanted to look at an educational context, I would then say such things as when people learn languages, they build up their own personalized meaning potentials. Language is a resource. Language is not a thing to be learned. It's an available semiotic resource. Development in a language, learning a language in an instructed setting, is building up your personalized meaning potential as part of the collective meaning potential that constitutes the entire semiotic system that we call language. And then they build up these personal potentials by gradually expanding their registerial repertoires. Notice it is all meaning-oriented, it is all functional. They have their own share in the collective meaning potential, so there's lots of collective stuff in there. They expand their registerial repertoires. They can take on more and more roles, and I think that is the activism in it. Incidentally, you may not know this, Halliday, of course, was seriously shot at for being a member of the Communist Party in England for the academics, yeah, and in North America, which was part of the reason why he decided at some point.
Vygotsky was because he wasn't.
Yeah, yeah, but you can see, the context in both cases. They were working with certain environments, and yet said that we believe this is what needs to be emphasized under sometimes very difficult situations. They can take on growing roles in a growing range of contexts, and these of course are social contexts, becoming semiotically more and more empowered. So very much the things you brought to the fore, the notion of empowerment through language, and that's very much where systemic functional linguistics as a theory is very much interested in education. I know of no other theory of language as a formal theory that gives a hoot about education. SFL is very different in that regard, precisely because one knows it is through language that social empowerment is possible, and the ethical responsibility goes with exactly that, that if you are in an environment to enable that empowerment, and certainly anybody in education is in that situation, and we in foreign language education are in it in very particular ways, has a responsibility to see to it that to the best of our abilities, we will enable our learners to have access to the empowering abilities that come with the expansion of the semiotic resources that go with language. Now, that doesn't mean that language is the only thing, but in an educational system, of course, which is what we're talking about instructed environments, language will of necessity have a very, very strong role to play. One may critique that some of these social and activity-oriented things aren't there, but the intention was right from the beginning to say that language is a form of activity and enactment of social relationships. So I would want to correct that a little bit, that isn't really a contradiction. So if I'm going to now say, what am I after if I am trying to develop learners who will be more empowered in a second language to be meaning makers at a relatively sophisticated level, given the limited time I have, and given the particular constraints of foreign languages in the American system. We don't need to belabor those, we all know them. Some of the interesting ways in which one can think of development are these, and Gordon mentioned one of them already. The distinction between synoptic and dynamic perspectives is a very, very important one that carries through the entire analysis of language. Grammar as the engine for sophisticated meaning making. It is the deepening and the extending of a functional notion of grammar that is one way to make sure that the resource capacity towards meaning making is extended. There's high awareness of numerous complementarities. There's actually a wonderful book by Halliday of complementarities, which is sort of similar to the dialectics that you're saying. It isn't just one thing or the other. It's both and. So we can make meanings in terms of looking at experience as object. We can also look at experience as event. And we can look at tense and aspect things. We can look at it this way, or we can look at it this way. And the grammar has these things available. And it is the awareness creation of that you do have those resources. If I help you, and in that sense I'm like you, I'm more top-down, I help you develop them so that you will be able to make choices. I am not there to dictate to you what you do with the resources, but I am darn well there to make you aware of the fact that they exist. And I will help you develop them. What you then do with them is your choice, because after all, you make situated choices in whatever situation you find yourself in. And then, since register and genre were were mentioned, there is indeed a theoretical distinction to be made here, but I think we are far beyond what happened in 1993 with regard to a considerably more sophisticated awareness of where the struggles were and where, in the meantime, acknowledgement can be made what is register and what is genre. So I think the stuff that went on in the 80s is probably not the most current way in which these things are dealt with. So going back to it, we've said lexicographer as meaningful, the prototypical bundling of lexicographer then in fact being a way of linking the experiential, the interpersonal, and the textual dimensions of meaning making, and that's of course the definition of register as resources that's available. From the teaching standpoint, the reason why register is not the most prominent, although theoretically, and your point was exactly correct, theoretically for Michael, it was register. And only subsequently did genre enter into it. Genre entered into it is because you can't teach register in a whole text environment. And so that's when Jim Martin's work, moving into the schools, then led to register is still too abstract. These are resources, bundles of resources that are available. In order to make that teachable, you need instances of texts, where instances of texts are best thought of as genre, because you can't teach everything. You can't just say text, 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 that gets you nowhere. You can only teach text as being a model or representative of a particular genre, and then you can set up a curricular trajectory depending on which lexicogrammatical resources are highly privileged. They are not one-to-one, but they're highly privileged for prototypically contribute to certain genre. And then you look at your three meta-functional environments, the experiential logical, the interpersonal, and the textual, and you can then create what is absolutely critical for an instructed environment, and particularly for foreign languages in higher education, a trajectory that gets out of the stuff of assumption that it is only formalist things that can drive development or should drive development, but it is in fact meaning that should be made available, and resources for meaning making should drive this undertaking. And that's of course a completely new thought for the way curricula are set up, and of course, as we know, in most cases, no curriculum exists anyway, so there's actually no talking about it. It's just a textbook that exists, which has very strange notions about what language is and what language development is, and it stops after 3 semesters anyway and doesn't know what happens thereafter. Therefore, no development towards any advanced abilities, because what little there is as far as grammar analysis is the most pedestrian structuralism one can possibly imagine, that cannot imagine meaning making in any case, and furthermore has no environment in which it can imagine what development of the full resource potential might actually look like. Because if you ask anybody in the more structural crowd, what does advanced abilities in a language mean, it's going to be pretty silent. You're going to wait for a long time as to what sort of an answer you would hear. In most cases, you won't get one. Not to talk too long, there's some major constructs within the theory that are very, very insightful and very, very helpful as you're going to set up a trajectory of development. One of them, of course, is to take beyond the major functional environment that I created. Language is a stratified system. It's a stratified system within which the resources of lexico-grammatical features, and notice no separation of lexicon and grammar. It can't be done anyway. We finally reached that point, but that was something that SFL said right from the beginning. You cannot separate the two. They are part of the same plane, expression plane. And then the semantics out there, the wording. Those two aspects of the content plane can be looked at as a stratified system. And what is central to the theory is that they are not linked in a direct way. They are linked in a way of construal. And I would like to emphasize very heavily the whole notion of grammatical metaphor is a theoretical construct that is enormously powerful as a theoretical construct within the theory and isn't just nominalizations. We have pounded on nominalizations endlessly. It's sort of an easy way to go there, and it makes sense in many ways, precisely because it is so obvious and so wonderfully felicitous with regards to many things. But the notion of grammatical metaphor is as an underlying way of understanding the expansion of meaning-making capacities is that there's a congruent way in which grammatical categories link directly to our experience, and then there is a non-congruent way of doing it. And it is the non-congruent way that opens up huge semantic spaces for new meanings to be made. So as a theory of language, it says, unless we understand that capacity of language, and as you know, most of you here, Halliday's language was in fact Chinese, so we're not talking European-centric stuff. Systemic functional linguistics is enormously well known in the Chinese context, which is such a wonderful irony because, you know, the stuff that goes on elsewhere is so English-centric. It's the Chinese that think the only reason why such a wonderfully rich theory could exist is because people are taught Chinese. That's their position on it. This is really great. By having looked at Chinese, he got some nice ideas, and isn't it good that he looked at Chinese? And to some extent, that's true. So anyway, we then look at these capacities for a language, just like lexical metaphor, and that's of course why he used that term. Lexical metaphor expands meaning-making by analogies and linkages that all of a sudden open up spaces of meaning on the lexical level that we didn't have before. Grammatical metaphor, through the fact that it is grammatical, of course, is enormously more powerful because grammar underneath drives the entire enterprise. So Halliday's insistence that grammar is the engine of the entire system is in fact built on the fact that we can do congruently and we can do incongruently. And we make choices which of these we use under what circumstances. And you get another trajectory there. And a good bit of what we do if we're pushing academic language abilities is we need to lay the groundwork first in clause and complex clause and mini-textual level to enable our learners to do those things even as we lay the groundwork for There are other ways in which you can take the same figure. See, the notion of the figure that's out there needs to be construed through language. The figure, the perceptual figure that's out there can be construed differently. And it is construed differently through the resources in the grammar that you're using. So going back to what I was supposed to be doing, I would then say, let me help my learners to start building up the resources that are initially necessary for a relatively congruent way of construal. And the major genre types are going to be the narrative genres. And then I will gradually build up, because that gives me all the clause structural stuff that I need, time and space and movement and referentiality, aspect, you know, the standard playground, so to speak, of the major resources that the language has. But then I'm going to start pushing the non-congruent things, and of course normalization is the obvious playground where I will try this out. And as it happens, of course, it leads us into the discursive behavior of various disciplines, all the way to the top of what we typically do in an undergraduate environment. So we will have such things as we're going to look at how can I set up a curriculum. I would then say I will have global continua from the oral to the more literate. I will have a semiotic continuum, which will lead from the congruent to the non-congruent. I will have a generic continuum where I would go to the fundamentally social nature of language, and that I would express in terms of dialogicality. Why not bring Martine in? And say there's the overt dialogicality of the utterance. That's what we used to call just communicative language teaching, one endless dialogue after another. Sorry, I'm being naughty. So the overt dialogicality of the utterance, gradually building up the covert dialogicality of intratextual aspects, something that we call coherence and cohesion. Notice what's maintained is the dialogicality. And that's very central to SFL, that whether it is oral language or whether it is written language, it is both dialogical. The difference is that in oral language, it's the overt dialogicality between the participants in conversation. In written language, it is put into the text, which means you had better have some resources available, some linguistic resources available to you that allow you to maintain the dialogical nature of meaning making in a written text. That means an enormous set of resources has to be developed with our learners. And notice that's L1 and L2 literacy brought together, because in many cases they don't know how to write in a dialogical way in L1. So you're doing the same thing, and I will take it further and I will say all the way to the dialogicality of the text within the language system, and you can take the dialogicality of the text within the system in two ways. You can call it, you can look at it synchronically. There are other texts that are going on at the same time. How are you able to bring the other texts into your text? And that's, of course, critical knowledge for academic writing or for academic speaking. And you can look at it diachronically and say, what else has been done with certain aspects of meaning making in this culture? And though we will talk about it as intertextuality, and the second one we would call, I think, in most cases, cultural literacy. To what extent are you able to bring in what the culture has known and valued to to show that you are a participant in the dialogue with the culture in the language, both contemporary and in historical depth. Now, all of that I would put under the category of language development, big time. So, another way of looking at it is, of course, in terms of genre families. So we have the genre family of the recording family, the genre of the explaining family, the genre of the arguing family, and again, you can set up trajectories for that. In each case, understanding that there are lexico-grammatical features that are bundled in certain ways underneath those. It is my job as an instructor to model them in model texts, to make you aware of the nature of those resources, to help you develop them by doing them. To wish to mean something is about as crucial as it gets. Most of the tasks that communicative language teaching does, or that written assignments do, are stultifyingly stupid, if I can be tautological, have therefore no way, snowball's chance in hell to be very colloquial, of ever asking a learner to actually wish to mean something that one would wish to mean as an intelligent adult. So I think we would have to look at that seriously. To what extent are we taking that responsibility seriously if we're talking about developing their abilities? So I would even say in that regard, it is my job to create those kinds of zones of proximal development, because unless I am providing resources that need to be further developed as they're doing them through the engagement with those tasks, they won't be developed. And that, to me, is a serious ethical problem. If you're there to teach people this stuff and you never engage them in that kind of work, you have actually not done your job. What would I say at the end to stop it all? Development, I would say, is greater flexibility and greater stability both, which is kind of a contradiction, but I think it's a nice contradiction, because you need to be more flexible, and at the same time you need to have stable resources available relatively quickly so you can be flexible. It's both. Then greater complexity in terms of genre types, greater complexity in terms of incorporating disciplinary knowledge with different forms of knowledge construction. You can go to Basil Bernstein then, and you can say we have horizontal knowledge construction and we have vertical knowledge construction. What are the major characteristics of horizontal knowledge construction? What are the major characteristics of vertical knowledge construction? Complexity in terms of authorial voice. Complexity in terms of identity and stance would be another way of saying, how am I going to develop that? And then, of course, systematic variations in semantic choices, which we would then say a learner has developed his or her voice in multilingual capacities. In other words, has been able to find the cryptotypes underneath, as Halliday says, for a particular language and culture, and has been able to appropriate them in a way that is not that you need to be like the native speakers, but that you are able to have a voice and are voicing something that uses both your L1 and your L2 and enables you to have a new voice that is different from this, different from this, but is in fact the multilingual voice. And to me, that would be the goal for language education. I'm not interested in them becoming whatever, Germans or whatever they to be. They don't need to be that at all. I'm not interested in that. What I am interested in, though, however, is can you become somebody that is a sophisticated person that can use these multiple resources in order to create your own voice. Enough of that.
Thank you.